Hi, and welcome back to another episode. Actually, the first episode of the Steeple Report. And on this episode, we're going to be speaking with Reverend Frank Webster. And full disclosure, Frank and I know each other quite well. And he actually was a part of my baptism. So there is a familiarity there. But because of that relationship, I wanted him to be my first guest. So welcome, Frank.
Hey, thank you, Rich. I appreciate it. I just hope we held you underwater in the Atlantic Ocean long enough for the baptism to actually work.
Yeah, yeah. It was done in the Atlantic Ocean, so whatever is in the Atlantic Ocean is now a part of me.
Oh boy, that should be fun. Nice and cold. Nice and cold. Well, warm on this side coming up from Bermuda and the Bahamas. So you should be in good shape.
It was a good time of year to do it. I believe it was in August, so the water was quite pleasant. The tide was out, so we weren't even having to surf the waves, so that was a good thing.
Well, it was an absolutely great day. It was wonderful. It was my privilege to be a part of your baptism and your entering into the community of faith in a new way.
Yeah, well, I thank you from the bottom of my heart and forever. So, why don't we dive into our discussion? Why don't we start with a brief discussion about your upbringing, and then we'll dive into your education and then your pastoral life.
Well, it's been a long story, so I'm going to try to keep it short, sweet, and to the point. I was raised in a Navy family, United States Navy. Both parents were active duty, and when they decided they wanted to start a family, my mom stepped aside. My dad stayed active duty. I had the privilege, as part of a family, to live in places like Virginia Beach, Williamsburg, Spain, uh, southeastern Maryland, San Diego, Hawaii, travel to places around the world, and it was. I wouldn't trade it for anything else. I wish I could have done more of it, and since I've done some other things, I have done. But that was my sort of my upbringing. We weren't really church going folks most of the time. We did do some of that in a couple of different places. My mom really wanted to make sure that we were involved in a church of some sort, and that we were receiving some sort of education within the bounds of a church. So part of that was at the submarine base chapel in Pearl Harbor, and then there was some more here in Virginia Beach. And from there, it was junior high and high school and college and the workforce and moving along, and then going to graduates, getting married, going to graduate school, and going into the pastorate and being called pastor for some reason.
So, you graduated from Old Dominion and here in Norfolk, Virginia, nearby Norfolk, Virginia, and and then you went to seminary here in Virginia as well, correct?
That is correct. I'm a graduate of Old Dominion University with a Bachelor of Science. Then I graduated from Union Theological Seminary, which is now Union Presbyterian Seminary, with a Master's of Divinity. Eventually, I did do some work at the Pittsburgh Theological Seminary and the University of Aberdeen in Scotland, working on doctoral work.
If I remember correctly, you were not far from your PhD from Pittsburgh, but actually serving as a pastor kind of superseded your completion. Is that about right?
Well, being a husband, a dad, being a pastor, and being a student all at the same time takes a little bit of an extra effort. That there were times when that had to be set aside, and there was one point in time where I had to say enough for now. Maybe a little bit later, but we've got to do family stuff and church stuff and faith stuff before working on finishing the doctorate.
So while you were in the seminary, there was also some pastoral work. Why don't you tell us about that?
Well, while I was a student at Union in Richmond, I was invited to be the student pastor of a small church in rural Virginia. St. James Presbyterian Church, awesome place, wonderful people. Got to meet wonderful folks, got to learn and understand that Sunday came every 7 days, and that one must be prepared for that to speak and bring God's word to the congregation. But also learned that in the middle of all of that, there was family and classwork and work that had to be done, and that there were also some parishioners. Well, periodically they'd wind up in the hospital or something had to be done, and would drive out to the country and have those conversations, or drive into downtown Richmond and have conversations at bedside in the hospital.
Yeah, I mean, I guess that was probably a wonderful introduction for you for what came next as a full-time pastor. So, if I remember the chronology correctly, after seminary, your first engagement was in California. Is that correct? Or Georgia?
No, it was actually in Georgia. I was called to South Georgia, just outside of Savannah, to start a church, a Presbyterian church, where there had never been any Presbyterian presence at all. And it's Effingham County. It's been there since the 1600s. And it was rural, and it was wonderful, and it was a fantastic opportunity, but it was also a fantastic experience for me, for my family, for everybody involved. We really had a great place to be, and it was a good place to be, and it was a place where people taught me a lot. I think they probably taught me more than I taught them.
What's one thing about your time at that church, one or two things that stand out that it kind of affected the way you viewed being a pastor and serving in a congregation?
Oh, there are a couple of fantastic things, and they sort of cover the spectrum. One was, we had a couple who was a part of the congregation who had been attending and then just disappeared for a time. And I ran into them in the store one day, months later. Was not able to catch up with them because of everything that was going on. And we got to talking, and I asked the simple question, where have you been? Why haven't you been back? Is it something I said? Is it something I've done? And this is a family that owns a small farm. And someone had said to them one Sunday at the end of church, we're such and such, and we expect our folks to wear proper suits and ties. Well, they were wearing the best clothes that they had. I don't care what you wear as long as you're there. Show up, be involved, come to being a part of a congregation. And we had that conversation again a couple more times, and they started coming back. And it dawned on me that I really needed to help our folks learn to understand, don't talk about people's clothes. Don't judge who you think they might be because of what they're wearing. Get to know them. Sit down, be quiet, listen. If this other person had sat down and listened to these folks, they would have understood that the clothes that they were wearing on Sunday morning was the absolute best they had. They were bringing their very best before God on a Sunday morning, and that's the best they had. Another thing that happened was sort of in that same realm. It's how we meet, greet, talk to other people. There was one day we were meeting in a warehouse. We had no building. We had no space. A local Lions Club had decided that we would be fine to use they had a 10,000 square foot warehouse, and we could use it every Sunday morning. We would have to set up the sanctuary and set up the seating and everything that goes with it, the sound system, all the rest of that. And we were about 15 minutes into worship one Sunday, and at the far back of the building, the door opened, and in comes a fellow who's wearing cutoff shorts, combat boots, cutoff t-shirt, and I mean cutoff. It was not a typical t-shirt. It was ripped, and lots of tattoos and different types of hair. And one of our elders stood up and turned around, and now you got to remember, this guy is an executive with a rather large corporation. So he walks to the back, greets this fellow, walks in with them, and they sat down together and worshiped, and he guided him through the worship service the entire time he was there. And the next week, that fellow came back with his family because he was treated with respect. And I think that was one of the things that those two things they really come together. And it's treat people with decency, dignity, and respect.
Yeah, I love the tension between those two stories. It one is a good example of how we as Christians need to, I think the right expression is meet people where they are, and accept people where they are in their journey, both as people and as Christians. And the other one, you're looking at a very mature Christian who saw the potential of somebody who made a very big step in walking in that door, and took them by the hand with a gentle spirit, and said, let me be with you, and help you, start your journey.
Exactly, Rich. You never know what someone's actually looking for until you get to know them. You need to get to know your neighbor, your friends, those around you, those who walk through the back door of the church. You don't know what their life situation is. None of us know exactly what they've gone through or how they've arrived where they are. But the point is, we were not called here to really take a look at that and say, yeah, that's not a good plan for life. We were called here to come before them and say, do you know Christ? And we don't have to say it like that. There's a lot of different ways of saying it, but it's being perhaps Christ in the presence of someone who doesn't know Christ, who's never met Christ, who doesn't have any of that information. But what they do know is they're looking for something. They're not sure what it is. And it really reaches back to the first century church, where people did not have big buildings to attend. There was the temple, and a lot of folks did not go to temple. They were ostracized. They were kept out. But they found something in this Christ fellow, and they began living a different life. And they were in the marketplace every day. They were in the business place every day. And people began to notice that there was something different. And that's when the church began sort of an explosion, because others were around and going, I don't know exactly what it is that person has, but whatever it is, I want some.
Yeah, yeah. It's interesting. I'm sure you've had many more examples than I, but when you are present and open and transparent about your faith, it's amazing how people will recognize that there's a change in you, and people that you might not even
That's
expect reach out and either want to just share in it or have questions. They may be seeking, but I've had that experience. I'm sure you've had it 100-fold. But
well, I've had
sorry.
some of that, but I know you've had some in the work that you have been doing for a time. And you've told me about some of these things, so I'm not going to embarrass you and go into lots of detail. But you have worked with some homeless folks, and you have been something very different from what they expected, and different from what they're used to experiencing in their homeless environment.
Well, you know, I just try, to as you know very well, one of my big principles is summed up in the term Imago Dei, that my own faith compels me to recognize that everybody around me is also in the image of God, and so that demands of me that I show them some respect, and to be honest with them, and try to be patient. Sometimes, you're dealing with people with an addiction issue or a mental health issue, what have you. So sometimes you have to, uh, manipulate that. That's the wrong word, not manipulate, but you have to be aware of the circumstances so that you can figure out the best way to either have the conversation or be of help to them in whatever way they need. Yeah, so from Georgia, then a very different circumstance with a very different type of church, size-wise and community. So why don't you tell us about that?
Well, we after about 6 years or so in Georgia, was called to a church here in the Tidewater area of Virginia that had been a new church development, a new church start, plant, whatever you want to call it, while I was in seminary in this area. And their pastor at a certain point left. And then the next pastor came in and retired. And I was called to come here and help them sort of revamp everything that was going on and help them move forward and move not necessarily in a new direction, but with a focus that helped them really help build disciples within themselves and disciples in their community and start being known more in the community. And it was quite an opportunity. It was very interesting because in this area of Hampton Roads, it's a transient area because it's very involved in the military. We have the largest naval facility in the world right here. So people are in and out every 2 years, and military folks have a tendency to get involved very quickly, dive in and get active. And folks that have not been military don't have that same tendency. So it was to take a church that was growing and had flatlined and see about helping it get back to the focus of the mission to which it had been called.
So within that challenge to allow the church to kind of see itself as you saw it from the outside and to rediscover its vision for itself, what's something that you experienced or that helped you to instruct them to see things in a different way, if you had an experience that you could share?
There was really, there's several, but there was one that really stands out. And it was at the end of worship one day, there were two of the elders of the church who had been at loggerheads for quite some time. And as I walked out the back of the sanctuary, instead of standing there and greeting people and saying, "Hi, how are you? Nice Sunday," blah, 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 and listening to folks, I looked at the two of them and said, you, my study now. And we all walked back there and they sat down. I closed the door, took my robe off and hung it up. And they just sat there in just profound silence. And I said, here's what's going on. You two are knocking heads. It's not productive. It's not fruitful. It's not Christian. So I don't care what the problem is. None of the three of us will leave this room until this problem is solved today. Now, who's going first? And they both just sat there and stared like, well, no one's ever said that before. And I had to bring them together because they were creating not a schism, but they were creating sort of a differentiation between groups of people within the church, kind of like what Jesus ran into when he was tried. He had the Sanhedrin, which was divided up by the Pharisees and the Sadducees, which is, well, I hate to say it, a little bit of what we have in Congress today, the Republicans and the Democrats, and everything goes down party lines. And it's about what I want, not about what's best for the kingdom. And we had to come to that point that day and decide, you two are both wanting the same thing. You're seeing it through different lenses. And we need to have you two swap glasses, do whatever. And it took us a couple hours. It did not happen instantly. But eventually they came to realize they both wanted the same thing done. They were just seeing it a little differently. And we had to have that conversation. And we had to have that conversation within the bounds and within the sort of the walls, if you will, of the congregation, of the church, but without lots of all the extra stuff that goes with it. Let's just have the conversation. We disagree. There are differences. Let's talk about this and see what we can do to fix it, rather than let's going out into the parking lot and having those parking lot discussions that I have seen happen in a number of places.
Yeah, I think, you demonstrated a good leadership principle, which is, well, several of them actually, which is to deal with an issue, confront it quickly, confront it, directly, and don't let it fester, and try to find a resolution as best you can. And I think you did all those things. And um,
Well, thank you.
I think there's also a story that I do want you to tell, that you told me quite a long time ago, about engaging in the community, and it's
Mm.
I think it's an important story of how people need to look outside the walls of the church and engage. If you know which one I'm talking about.
I think I do. It's the one about hot dogs and hamburgers. Um,
That's
and
the
it was
one.
a heck of a story. It was not even our church. It was another church, not far from us, probably 10, 12 miles away. Not that long a drive. But they had a group of men who decided that the building needed some work, and they needed to do some things. And this was a group of guys that starting to get together on Friday mornings and Friday midday, things like that. And they would come to the church and cut grass and do things. And there were a few retired folks and a couple of guys that didn't work on Fridays, and they just rearranged their schedules to do this. But one of the Friday afternoons, after they'd been doing all this work, one of the guys said, "Man, I'm hungry." Well, they dragged a grill out from the back of the church and said, "Well, let's just cook some dogs and burgers." And one of the guys hopped in his car, went down the street to the grocery store, picked up some pack or two of hot dogs, pack or two of hamburgers, some buns, some soft drinks, and ketchup and mustard and whatever else you want to put on there, and brought it all back. And they fired up that grill and they got going to town. They were it was a wonderful time for them because they stopped working and they were just talking about life and faith. And then they noticed something a little different. And that was all these little bitty neighborhood kids were lined up at the fence. And they're just sort of standing there watching. And one of the guys said, "Come on over. You want a hot dog? Come on over. You want a hamburger?" And these kids came over the fence. And it's in a neighborhood that is I'm not sure what word to use to describe it, but everybody there is on housing assistance. And these kids just came over the fence, and there was 10 or 12 kids, and they were having a great time. They had to go back to the store and pick up more dogs and burgers.
That's a good problem to
And
have when you want to give to. Yeah, well, that comes with the territory.
well, and it was a great thing. So they actually had to go and get more, and then the next week they did it again, and they brought more with them, and there were more kids. And the week after that, there were more kids, and the week after that, some of these kids were dragging their parents into the church. And one day, one of the parents came to the church in the middle of the week, wanting to talk to the pastor, who's a friend of mine, and said, "What are your guys doing here on Fridays?" He said, I really don't know. They're probably just cleaning things up and repairing windows and storm damage and stuff like that. And well, they've also been cooking and feeding some of these little kids out here. Pastor didn't know anything about it. He went, "Well, I didn't know that. That's great. I'm glad they're doing that." Well, that next week, that family and another family came to church, and they came to worship. And a few weeks later, they started attending the Sunday school programs. And a few weeks after that, there were a couple more families, and then a couple more families, and it was all because a group of people saw that there was a simple need, and they took care of it. But they did it in such a way that it was friendly, it was inviting. There was no hard-handedness about any of it. It was just a love for their neighborhood and for their neighbor. So they did it, and they fed little kids hot dogs and hamburgers,
Yeah, I
and
mean,
that created this new little bit of inspiration within the life of that congregation and that community as a whole.
I remember when you first told me this story. What struck me was, well, it kind of addresses two things. Oftentimes in church, we're talking about being a welcoming church, and sometimes I think people kind of envision how that manifests itself as somebody standing by the front door and saying welcome on Sundays. This was truly welcoming and engagement beyond those, because when you're engaging those that are already coming in the door, you're not really extending your influence beyond who's already walking in the door. So I think there's the old expression of preaching to the choir, or the other thing is it kind of addresses a way of doing evangelism, is that it's not always being conversion first. Sometimes it's just demonstrating love. And
It's getting to know your neighbor. Exactly. It's getting to know your neighbor, who they are, what they're about. I'll never forget, I heard a statement by someone who does a lot of these things. And he said, he looked around at this congregation and said, no one who came through these doors today who's never been here before is looking for a friendly church. And the place just went silent. He said, they're looking for a friend. And that's a difference.
Yeah, I mean, when we talk about the whole evangelism thing, the somebody that is very well known in the evangelistic kind of world is, I think his name is Ray Comfort. He's an Australian guy. He does a lot online, and he's well known. I think it's called Living Waters, and I have no doubt about his faith, but when I see him, he's a very in your face kind of evangelist, where he's challenging everything that people are and the way they live their life. And okay, I get it. You're proving to them, the difference between the way they're living and whether or not that course of life's going to get them into heaven or not. I get it. But to me, and maybe it's just a style, maybe it's just how different people interact with others. But to me, it's almost kind of like so in your face that I wonder if it pushes more people away from him than it does attract.
Well, you're absolutely right. I think it's a personal style that folks have developed over a period of time, thinking that it's the right way to do it. But there's a lot that it leaves out, and that's another story. When we moved back up here from Georgia, maybe the second or third week we were here, we were down at Virginia Beach at the boardwalk, walking down the boardwalk, and we came around to go to a place to get some ice cream cones, and there are two of the street evangelists standing there, and this one fella just gets right in my face, and he's yelling about me, sinner, if you died tonight, do you know where you'd wake up? I went, yeah, you'll probably find me at the dessert table. And that was a very flippant response. But he did not know that I was preparing to preach the following morning. He never got to know me.
Yeah, know your audience, right?
So how can he possibly introduce me to a Savior that he thinks he knows? And whether he knows that Savior or not is irrelevant. It was, in my mind, it was the way he went about it. And I get it. I understand it. It's not my style. I'm going to take some time and get to know you. I know some folks that are missionaries that have served in Africa and Southeast Asia. And one served for a major denomination, large denomination. And they kept sending him letters. Okay, how many baptisms, how many conversions, how much of this? And after about 6 months, he said, I'm just getting to know the people. I'm getting to know their language. I'm getting to know their routine and letting them get to know me. We'll talk about baptisms and conversions later. The first thing to do is get to know my neighbor and who he and she is. It was very, to me, that was very eye-opening to take a look at that and go, there's a serious amount of validity to that.
I know that in the secular part of your life, and definitely in mine, we've both been involved in sales and have been trained what I prefer to call professional sales, rather than just being a bait and switch kind of guy. But I mean, we've been trained to do sales in a particular way, and one of the and it's not the most elegant way to be said, but one of my mentors said the last thing you want to do when you're selling something is show up and throw up. And the meaning was, don't show up and just spew out everything that you know about your product. He said, if you don't know this, potential client, you're going to be much better served learning by asking questions, and then that'll allow you to tailor your pitch to giving solutions to where their pain points are. And I kind of feel the same way about evangelism, is that you have to get to know the people in order for you to be able to tailor this wonderful story of Christ and the kingdom that will register with them in a way that will be attractive rather than a repellent.
Well, one of the keys in sales is, and in anything, whether it's car sales or stereos or carpet, whatever, people tend to do business with those they know, like, and trust. If I don't know you and I don't like you, I'm sure not going to trust you.
I think that goes without saying. Yeah, I've walked out of
And
many situations because I just thought the guy was taking me for a ride. I'm like, okay, I'm done. Your product might be great, but I don't trust the messenger.
exactly. And I think in the church, we do the same thing sometimes. We get hung up on programs and methodologies for evangelism, if you want to use it that way. But those methodologies don't have anything to do with getting to know my neighbor. Jesus said that. Who's your neighbor? My youngest son recently bought a house in another city, not far that far from here, a couple of 100 miles, and he is the only person in the neighborhood of his age and of his skin color and all the rest of it. And I said, "So how do you feel?" He goes, "I've got some of the coolest neighbors in the world, Dad." I said, "Exactly. Get to know your neighbors. Let them get to know you. Be a neighbor. Don't try to prove anything to anybody. Just be a neighbor. Be the person that you are, and where you can help. But get to know them. Know them by
Yeah,
name. Know who they
yeah.
are, what they do."
And I mean, that could be a whole discussion in itself
It really good.
about different people's human nature. You and I have one thing among many, but we have this one thing in common, is that we're both curious about people. And I've seen it in you, and you've obviously seen it in me, that when I see people, I ask questions, I joke with them, I try to create an environment that they'll open up and talk and feel comfortable. And I remember years ago when I was consulting for this startup company, and I'm trying to create a go-to-market strategy for their salespeople, and they happen to be hiring the wrong kind of people. And and the guy's like, "Why isn't it working?" I said, "Well, it's really hard to teach people to like people." And the people he was hiring were kind of into the product, uh, but and there is a lot to be said for product expertise, but you could teach that to somebody who actually has people skills. And so they kind of had that reversed, I thought. But anyway, um,
Well, it's the old simple adage: sit down, shut up, and listen.
yeah, yeah. And with my business partner in Crossing Capital Group, we have a book, Fishing Differently, and one of the big stresses we have in that is listening to their stories and celebrating the faithful. And
Exactly.
that's all about when you come into a church or any circumstance, shut up and listen, and learn what motivates them, what is motivated them positively and negatively, and celebrate the wins that they've had, and mourn with them the losses they've had. And it's about creating a relationship, and from there you can move on. Speaking of moving on, So from Virginia, you took a step up to an even bigger church next in
Well,
California.
I don't know. You want to call it a step up? It's a larger. It was a larger church, larger congregation,
That's what I
uh,
meant. Step up in
and
size. Not
some
I was
people
not
would.
making any spiritual or faithful judgments. I was speaking of size.
No, there are folks that think some pastors get into this to start with a small church or as an associate and just move their way up some sort of a ecclesiastical corporate ladder, and that's not really what. Well, there probably are a few. That's not what most of us have endeavored to do. But it was a larger congregation in a more affluent community with a very different mindset, and it was also a wonderful time. It wasn't long lived, but it was. I made some great friends there. I stay in touch with a number of the folks that were there, and I it was a struggle. I'll be perfectly honest. It was tough, but it was good.
I know that, and I'm not sure there's a value in getting into nitty gritty. There was um, maybe a fundamental disagreement about, your vision and their vision of where the church was supposed to go. But I do recall you telling me a story that has stuck with me, um, about engaging, um, with the community. And I think there was somebody even outside of your church that was doing something that affected you, that you've still carried with you as a lesson.
Well, there were a number of things that happened, but one of the things um, that happened was there several different groups of people within the congregation have different responsibilities. And this one particular group was making what you call blessing bags. You fill them up, you put socks and water and canned meats and crackers and toothbrushes and toothpaste, and you put all these things in, and they're wonderful things to be able to hand out. They are just fantastic. And I still carry some in my car today. And when I come across someone who's homeless that I have not engaged before, if I'm in traffic or the intersection, I'll roll the window down and I will hand them one of these bags with all these goodies in it. And they're usually very gratefully appreciated. I've even gotten to the point where I keep some Ziploc bags of dog food. And because I've seen several folks that have dogs with them, well, let's give them something to eat too. But this one particular group, I was meeting with them one evening, and I looked at the card they put in there, and they said, "This is a gift to you from blah 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 blah." I flipped it over. I said, "But there's no email address, there's no phone number, there's no street address." And one of the folks looked me right in the face and said, "Well, we don't want to do that. They might actually come here."
Wow.
And I was floored. I went, "Well, why wouldn't they want to come here?" For spiritual nourishment, for nurture, not necessarily to look for a handout, but to find out what their faith is all about and begin to dig into that and to help with that and work with that and walk with somebody down this spiritual path towards a relationship with God in Christ. And it really floored me that they were people within the bounds of the church who were still thinking in those terms. And yes, it shocked me. And I said a few things about that evening. I asked those questions.
I bet. Yeah, unfortunately,
It wasn't well received, but they had never really thought about it.
I think there's a lot more of the not in my backyard kind of thinking. And, like you had the two guys in your office and you addressed it. I think, if a pastor sees that, I think that's something that, has to be addressed or it will continue on in the culture. And,
Yes, it's one of those internal cultural things that people have a tendency. It's like today's society. If we're in conversation around a table somewhere and politics comes up, people get really quiet. They don't want to talk about left versus right, up, down, whatever. But I think that's to our detriment. We should have those conversations, and we should be willing to have the conversations, and at the same time be willing to have the conversation and not consider the person on the other side of an issue an enemy. We're brothers and sisters in this. We may be wired differently. A wise man once said, I don't know who it was. I'm not even going to pretend to try and figure out who did it. But he said the left wing and the right wing are both on the same bird. And those are the things we need to find out how we can bring together in a way that is representative of the kingdom of God, the Imago Dei, not my political preferences or somebody else's political preferences.
Yeah, and it reminds me that too often I think people think of community engagement as needing to be part of a program at a church, when we can all do that individually in our own way, by ourselves or with our family or friends. It doesn't have to be in a formalized program through the church. Every day we can do something that, extends a hand of love outside of, to something that's, outside of our comfort zone, or to somebody in need. And then I think, there was another example, if I remember correctly. I think it might have been even an extension of that story, about a restaurant owner feeding people under an overpass or something like that, if I remember correctly.
Well, there's a restaurant owner and his wife and family who close, I want to say Mondays at noon, and then they pile up all this food from this little restaurant, and they go to this homeless encampment under the underpasses in Los Angeles, and they feed hundreds of people once a week. That's all. They just do it once a week, but they don't ask for anything. They don't ask anybody to do anything. And folks have now come to know them and have gotten to the point where they're starting to ask questions. And that's because they decided that one day a week, they're going to close at noon, and they're going to have all this food ready to go, and they're going to load it up in their couple of vans, and they're going to go over, they're going to set up the table, set up the food, and they're going to serve those who are hungry. And they're going to serve them with this attitude that Christ loves them, and we have food. This is what we have to offer. They don't have something else. So this is what their offering is. And they bring the food and they feed people. And it's fresh, cooked, good food. And no one is treated with any kind of disrespect. It's all grace. It's grace driven. It's amazing.
I think from what we've heard from you thus far, and the examples and stories we've talked about, my next question might, or your reply to my next question might be obvious, but I want to give you the opportunity to say, how would you summarize your faith and the expression of your faith?
I would go back to a sermon that rose out of sort of the expression of my faith. And that's the sermon about the pickle. A pickle is a cucumber until it's put in the brine, and it's left in the brine. And when it's done, what happens is all those fluids, all those liquids from the brine itself fill the cucumber, and all of the fibers, the very sense and being of that cucumber is no longer a cucumber, it's now a dill pickle. And I think, and that's what happens to us. It's what happened to me. I was very different in another phase of my life, but somewhere along the line, I got pickled. And I hope every congregation in the world and every follower of Christ in the world can at some point get pickled and be different, because what happens is once you are pickled, you can't change it and go back. Right. Something has happened. The very fiber
and there's no alcohol involved in this pickle. No alcohol in this pickle. This is a different kind of pickled.
This is a big old dill pickle, and it's every fiber and core of my being is different from what it was a long time ago. And my hope, my prayer is that I'll put it lightly and shortly and sweetly and succinctly, I hope we all get pickled.
I love that metaphor, because it could be extended and extended, because, and you and I have talked about this, that, once the transformation occurs, and like you said, you can't go back, but once the transformation occurs, then the way you view yourself, but also others around you, simply changes, and therefore it elicits a change in your behavior, because you see the people around you a bit differently, and so, it's not just your own internal transformation, but it's how you engage the world, and how you engage others, and how you choose to live your life. It really is a transformation that's internal and external.
It absolutely is. Prior to that, and I think a lot of us could probably take a look at that and say that, yeah, before being pickled, I saw people and situations as opportunities. Now I see the imago Dei, and that is two very different ways of seeing our world and our place in the world.
Yeah, that registers with me. Yeah, that people are not opportunities for you to exploit. Yeah, yeah, that registers with me. So, you know, um, what's next for Reverend Frank Webster?
Well, I have been certified now as a church consultant through a couple of organizations, through Tom Rayner's group, the Rayner Group, and working with a company that I helped start, Impact Church Advisors, and we help churches learn not just what their mission is, but how to focus on that and how to do that in such a way that they can continue to do those things that make them distinct from the rest of the world.
Where do you think churches are? I mean, I'm sure, for as many churches as there are, they have their individual stories, but do you think there's a lot of churches that, to use the expression, are just doing church and are not really living outside their four walls very well?
I think there are a number of those. I don't know how many, I wouldn't try to guess it, but I think most churches can take a look at themselves and take a serious look, and they can know rather quickly whether they are living, uh, becoming a living sanctuary, versus are they showing up and is it a country club? Do we show up on Sundays and do we say hi, hello, how are you, blah, 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 and we talk and chat and then don't have anything to do with anybody for another week or 2 weeks, and then we come back? Or then there are some who will, in the days of COVID, will now sit and watch and go, okay, that's nice, but are we really taking it in? And I know of some churches that have, uh, they've been growing in numbers because what they've been doing is not about growth. It's been about building disciples. It's been about seeing the imago Dei in my neighbor. It's been about seeing what needs to happen in our world, rather than, okay, we now have more money so we can do something else. We can now call a better pastor. We can bring in an associate. We can build a new building. They're not worried about those things. They're worried about sharing the gospel of Jesus Christ with whoever they can, wherever they can, and they're trying to do it in a way that is full of grace and peace.
Yeah, if I were to try to summarize that in a quick metaphoric way, or metaphorical, I think it is, um, it would be kind of that idea of the church is not the building, the church is us. And
It's exactly. Don't go to church, be the church.
right, right. Well, I thank you for spending time with us. I think, the stories, examples that you shared with us, I think, should resonate with a lot of people and maybe give them some inspiration of how to think about, where they are now, and maybe, what they need to be thinking about to engage outside themselves and outside of their church. So I thank you for the time you spent with us.
Well, Rich, thank you for inviting me. Thank you for having me. If there's anything I can do to help you and your mission, please just give me a shout. Let me know. I'm available.
I know you always are. So thanks again. Love you, brother. And that'll conclude our first. Whoops, I muted myself. That will conclude our first
Technical
episode.
difficulties.
So yeah, I'll get better at this, people. I'm new to this. I've never been a YouTube channel host, so bear with me. We'll get better at this. So if you've enjoyed this, there's going to be more of these types of interviews to come with different people in different walks of life in the Christian community, contributing different things from their own spiritual gifts to the kingdom, and hopefully they will have as many interesting stories and experiences, and be able to share their expertise with us. And so stay with us and check back. My intention is to post videos every Sunday. So hopefully you can subscribe and like and share these videos. That'll help us grow. So thank you, Reverend Webster. And that'll
Thank
conclude
you.
our time together.
Peace.